She was young, she was smiling, and she was everything the British Empire hoped for. But on a cold night in November 1817, she bled for 15 hours. Alone, her child was born dead. And then, she followed. At 2:30 a.m., Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate heir to the British throne, took her last breath. She was 21, and just like that, the future of an empire vanished. Church bells rang across London. Black cloth covered every window. Men, grown men, wept in the streets. For once, the entire British Empire agreed on something. Charlotte was gone, and something sacred had died with her. But why did she die? And what happened in that room, where no one came to save her? She was born into silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind thick with tension, the kind that falls over a house where no one speaks, but everyone waits. And in that silence, on the 7th of January, 1796, a child arrived at Carlton House. Her name, Charlotte Augusta of Wales. She came into a world expecting her, hoping for her, needing her, because the British royal family was cracking. George III, the Mad King, was losing his mind, slipping into darkness one moment at a time. His son, George IV, was drunk on scandal, buried in debt, and despised by the people. His marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick, Charlotte's mother, was not a romance. It was a transaction, forced by Parliament, signed in bitterness. They quarreled before the wedding night ended. So Charlotte, even before her first breath, was a political solution, a patch on a leaking throne. She was England's answer to its royal shame, and she was born a symbol, not a child. The doctors wrapped her in silk. The press praised her tiny hands. Crowds celebrated. Parliament rejoiced. Because finally, there was an heir, a future. A child untouched by her father's infidelity or her mother's vulgarity. A baby innocent enough to believe in. But inside Carlton House, the silence remained. Charlotte's father, George, saw her once, maybe twice. He rarely held her. He forbade her mother from visiting. And Charlotte, barely 6 months old, became the center of a custody battle. Not between two parents who loved her, but between two factions who hated each other. She grew up under strangers, nannies, tutors, men with powdered wigs and cold fingers. No bedtime kisses, no lullabies, only protocol. She learned to curtsy before she could read. She learned Latin before she learned love. And by the time she was 8, she knew one thing for certain. She was not a girl. She was a symbol. But Charlotte was stubborn. She laughed when they told her not to. She asked questions they couldn't answer. She played with dogs and bit her lip when nervous. She wasn't graceful. She stomped. She wasn't silent. She spoke. She looked more like her grandfather George III than either of her parents. Wide face, heavy eyes, but eyes that sparkled. She hated embroidery. She loved riding. The public adored her. They called her our princess. They compared her to Diana Spencer 2 centuries early. Wherever she appeared, churches, gardens, theaters, people stood still. They whispered her name like a promise. Charlotte, a name that meant hope. Because the rest of the royal family was chaos. Her father, Prince George, was drowning in mistresses and gambling. Her mother, Caroline, was exiled to foreign courts, surrounded by rumors. The other royal princes? Drunk, disgraced, childless. But Charlotte? She smiled. She was the bridge between a broken palace and a weary public. And the older she got, the more everyone needed her to succeed. She had no siblings. She was the line. If Charlotte failed, the monarchy failed. But no one asked her what she wanted. They only asked what she represented. At age 10, they started talking marriage. Not with boys, but with nations. Russia, Prussia, the Netherlands. Every letter to the king came with a subtle offer. We have a nephew. Our duke is a fine character. Charlotte was 10. She had just discovered honey cakes, but her future was already in draft. At 12, she was shown portraits of men she had never met. At 13, she was forbidden to be alone with any boy under age 50. At 14, she asked, "May I choose?" They laughed. So she wrote letters. She confided in her governesses. She told them she wanted love. Real love, she wrote. Not crowns and coins. She wanted to marry a man who would walk beside her, not behind. She wanted a life that wasn't built from treaties. But Charlotte's life wasn't hers. She belonged to the crown, to the court, to the people, even her heartbeat, political. And behind the palace doors, plans were already moving. One man watched quietly from the shadows. Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, a minor German royal, educated, reserved, poor by royal standards, but polished. He had no scandals, no illegitimate children, no debts, no mistresses. In other words, he was perfect. Charlotte met him when she was 17. He bowed, she smiled, and for once, the girl who had been born to represent an empire felt seen. He didn't talk at her. He talked to her. He didn't bow to her. He stood with her. They walked in gardens. They shared stories. He listened. She laughed. And she told her ladies-in-waiting, "This is the one." Her father objected at first, but the public approved, and Charlotte, for once, had the people and the palace behind her. In May at 1816, they married. She wore white. He looked terrified. The people cheered. London lit candles. Parliament exhaled. The monarchy had its future, and Charlotte had love. But shadows do not lift easily. Her body, shaped by generations of royal inbreeding, was fragile. Her spine curved. Her cycles were irregular. Her health, already precarious, began to falter after the wedding. She fainted during a carriage ride. She collapsed during dinner. The doctors said it was nerves. The palace said it was nonsense. But Leopold knew better. He stayed close. He rubbed her hands when they went cold. He read to her at night, and when she whispered, "Do you think I'll be a good mother?" he kissed her brow. "You already are." In early 1817, Charlotte became pregnant. And the bells rang again. The newspapers declared a second coming. The child of Charlotte would be England's salvation, a new start, a pure bloodline, a return to peace. People named their daughters Charlotte. They toasted Leopold. The king smiled. And Charlotte, for the first time in her life, believed in the dream they had placed upon her. But she was 21. Her pelvis was narrow. She was carrying a large child. The physicians insisted she could deliver naturally. Charlotte trusted them. She always trusted the system. She had never known anything else. On the morning of November 3rd, 1817, she went into labor, and everything began to unravel. But even as she rested her hand on her swollen belly, smiling at the thought of lullabies and first steps, The storm had already begun to gather. Behind her closed doors, the palace was preparing a cradle. But they should have been preparing a coffin. Because what happened next was not a birth. It was a slow unraveling of her body, of her dream, of an empire's illusion. And when the moment came, no one could stop it. Not the doctors, not the crown, not even Leopold. The smile stayed. But it wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the painters, the pamphlets, the palace. It belonged to a nation that needed her to glow, even as she faded. And so, Charlotte kept smiling, because that was her duty. But behind closed doors, she was struggling. Pregnancy did not suit her body. She was constantly nauseous. Her ankles swelled like bruised fruit. Her back ached under the weight of expectation. Doctors dismissed her discomfort. They told her to walk more, to eat less, to breathe slower. They used words like hysteria and female sensitivity. They never used the word risk, because to them, Charlotte wasn't a patient. She was a royal symbol. By the summer of 1817, her body was sending signals, but no one listened. She fainted in the bath. They said it was common. She lost appetite. They said it was nerves. She woke in the night asking for her mother. They told her to stay composed. And still, she smiled. In public, she walked through parks with Leopold, one hand on her belly. She waved to crowds. She posed for portraits. She signed letters with, "We are well, the baby kicks, the country smiles with us." But the smile was not hers. It was borrowed from the image they needed her to be. Then came November 3rd, 1817. It began like a whisper, a slow discomfort just below her ribs. Charlotte, now 9 months pregnant, called for the doctor. Sir Richard Croft. He arrived quickly, bringing with him not reassurance, but routine. Croft was trusted with royal births. He believed in patience, discipline, dignity. But nature had other plans. The contractions grew more intense as hours passed. Charlotte endured in silence. She bit her lip, grasped the linens, clung to hope. 30 hours passed before Croft admitted that something might be wrong. But still, he chose not to intervene. No special measures, no alternate approach. He believed observation was wiser than action. Even as Charlotte grew quiet, even as her breath came slower, Croft stood still. Leopold waited behind the door, helpless. He had been her prince, her friend, her hope. Now he was just a man, waiting in the dark. By hour 38, Charlotte's voice had faded, not because the struggle was over, but because it had taken too much. She asked for water. It was denied. They believed it would slow the process, and still, no one stepped in, because Charlotte was royalty, and royalty does not cry out. Royalty endures. At hour 42, the child arrived, but there was no sound, no cry, no breath. The boy, her son, was born still. The silence that followed was not peace. It was disbelief. No one had prepared for this. No one had imagined this. Charlotte reached out, but he had already been taken away. They wrapped him quietly. There was no farewell, only a still room, heavy with memory and breath. Charlotte tried to smile. She said, "At least it's over." She did not know. It had just begun. That night, her breathing changed. Her hands trembled. She grew warm with fever. A midwife noticed, but Croft dismissed it. She just needs rest. At midnight, Charlotte whispered, "Something's wrong." By 2:20 a.m., her words slowed. By 2:30, the room fell quiet. They called Leopold. He rushed in, but Charlotte was already gone. Her heart had faded gradually, not from violence, but from being left too long without care. A quiet decline, and no one heard. When the news broke the next morning, England stopped. People gathered in the streets, shops closed, churches rang their bells for hours. One writer noted, "Never was grief so universal. Never did a single death steal the breath of a whole nation." And still, the palace said, she died peacefully. A softened truth, because in truth, she had faded slowly, while voices outside debated, and no one truly saw her. Croft, the royal doctor, would not recover from the storm that followed. Months later, he too passed away, suddenly. During another difficult delivery, 3 lives, 1 night, 1 future changed forever. The smile? It was gone now. But it remained on the portraits, on the coins, on the pages of books that avoided the full story. They would write, "Charlotte Augusta of Wales, loved by all, lost too soon." But they would not write this. She could have lived. But her passing was only the beginning, because Charlotte's absence didn't just leave a hole in one heart. It disrupted a dynasty. Uncles scrambled to marry. The line of succession spun into chaos. And from that turmoil, a new queen would one day rise. But not before the crown realized they had not just lost a daughter, they had lost the future. There are nights that rewrite history. Not with war, not with fire, but with silence. And November 5th, 1817, was such a night. It began, like most tragedies, in the absence of urgency. After the stillbirth of her son, Princess Charlotte of Wales was said to be resting. The sheets had been changed, the cradle removed, the midwives dismissed. Croft, the royal obstetrician, stood by the window with folded arms. He looked tired, relieved even. In his notes he wrote, "The delivery was long but natural. Her Royal Highness is in recovery." But she was not recovering. She was breaking. Inside her body, something had ruptured. Her uterus, torn, her veins leaking, her blood pooling where no one could see. Outside, the palace was quiet. Inside her chambers, it was not. Charlotte moaned, not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft, almost embarrassed sound. She asked again for water. She was denied. She asked if her child had been baptized. No one answered. She asked for Leopold. They said he needed rest. She didn't protest. She never did. Charlotte had learned early, queens do not cry, queens do not bleed. But she was bleeding, slow, silent, dying. At 11 o'clock p.m., her pulse dropped. At 12:15, she began shaking. At 1:20 a.m., she vomited blood. Only then did someone whisper, "Fetch the prince." Leopold entered the room barefoot. The fire had gone out. The air smelled of iron and old sweat. Charlotte was pale, her eyes glassy. He took her hand. She whispered, "Is it over?" He nodded. She tried to smile. It cracked at the corners. At 2:30 a.m., her head fell to the side. No cry, no gasp, just stillness. The woman who had carried the hopes of a kingdom. was now a body cooling in a canopy bed. No one moved. No one screamed. For several minutes, there was nothing but the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Croft wrote again. Cause of death, exhaustion following childbirth. It was a lie. She had bled to death. Preventable, treatable, ignored. And in the morning, the sun still rose. But something in England did not. When word reached the people, it was like a shockwave. Markets closed, ships docked, churches overflowed. There was no announcement, just wailing. Mothers clutched their infants. Old men removed their hats. Even critics of the monarchy stood silent. Because Charlotte was not just royal, she was beloved. She had been their hope, their redemption, the light after so much shadow. And now, she was gone. Leopold locked himself in a room. He did not eat. He did not speak. He simply sat, staring at a chair that would never again be filled. He had known pain. He had buried friends, brothers, soldiers. But this was different. This was the future dying in his hands. Charlotte's funeral was held in St. George's Chapel. The coffin was small, white, adorned with lilies and a single crown. Inside, her body lay beside her child's. He had no name, no title, just silence. The kingdom wept. And in the pews, a question began to fester. Who is next? Because now there was no heir, no clear line, no Princess of Wales, no future queen, no bridge between monarch and people. Only chaos. King George III, already lost to madness, was never told. He sat in his chambers, playing with ribbons and muttering to ghosts. When they whispered of Charlotte, he asked, "Is she to marry the Prussian?" And the courtiers said yes. Because how do you tell a madman that his hope has died? How do you tell a father that his daughter died alone? How do you tell a nation it has no tomorrow? Behind closed doors, panic began to stir. The House of Hanover had no backup. Charlotte was the only legitimate grandchild. Now her uncles, middle-aged, scandal-plagued, childless, were expected to produce an heir. Suddenly, royal weddings erupted like fire drills. Dukes remarried, princes took new wives, deals were struck across borders, all to prevent what England feared most: a crown with no head. And in this desperate, scrambling chaos, one child would eventually be born, to a German princess, in a quiet room, far from the throne. Her name? Victoria. But that was still years away. For now, England grieved, and the palace rewrote. They painted Charlotte smiling. They removed Croft's journals. They blamed fate. But it wasn't fate. It was a system that refused to listen, that turned a woman into a vessel, that made her smile until she couldn't. They buried her in white. They dressed her like a bride. But she never made it to the altar of motherhood. Her child was gone, her breath gone, her name whispered, then silenced. And yet, in the quiet corners of the country, people still lit candles, still left flowers, still said her name with a kind of reverence that no monarch after ever earned. Because Charlotte wasn't just a princess, she was what could have been. But grief has a way of fading, and power does not wait long. While England mourned, the palace moved. Within months, new brides were chosen, new treaties signed, New wombs watched, because the question was no longer, how did Charlotte die? It was, who can replace her? Before the silence came the celebration. Before the death came the dream. Before the coffin came the cradle. Because for a few short months in 1817, the British Empire was not mourning. It was waiting. Waiting for a cry. A baby's cry. A royal cry. The one that would secure the line. The one that would redeem the throne. The one inside Princess Charlotte of Wales. She was 20 years old, and she was glowing. It began with whispers in court. She is with child. Then came confirmation. Charlotte was officially pregnant, and the country erupted. It was as if England had held its breath for decades, and now, at last, could exhale. The bells rang, the newspapers roared, the people cheered. To the public, it was more than a baby. It was a prophecy fulfilled, a future guaranteed. And for the first time in years, the monarchy was loved again. Not for its kings, not for its wars, but for her. Charlotte was not perfect. She was stubborn, sharp-tongued, restless, but she was human, and they loved her for it. She rode horses pregnant. She laughed too loud. She waved to commoners when told not to. She was no cold-blooded aristocrat. She was warmth wrapped in silk. And now, she was to become a mother. Every detail of her pregnancy became national news. Was she craving oranges? Was it a boy? What name would she choose? People bet in pubs, wrote poems, sewed miniature bonnets and blankets. Merchants released royal birth commemorative china. Parliament passed resolutions of congratulations. The church held special prayers. Even the stock market reacted. Her womb moved nations. Inside the palace, though, Charlotte was afraid. She didn't show it, of course. She smiled. She made jokes. She held Leopold's hand in public. But when the doors closed, she whispered, "Will it hurt? Will I die?" No one answered. She read old letters from her grandmother. She studied medical books. She wrote in her journal, over and over, "If I do not survive, let them know I tried to be happy." Leopold watched her change. Her steps slowed. Her breathing shortened. Her laughter dimmed. And still, the people watched. Every day, new poems arrived at the palace gate. Every week, letters from strangers praying for her safety. Every month, artists painted her, glowing, motherly, divine. She was no longer Charlotte. She was the mother of England. But she had not yet given birth. And the pressure, it pressed into her ribs, into her dreams, into her blood. In private, doctors whispered, "She is too narrow. The child is large. She must deliver naturally." There were no other options. Royal women did not have surgery. Royal women did not scream. They bled. They endured. They obeyed. Charlotte asked, "Can my mother come?" They said no. "Can I speak to a woman who's done this before?" They said there was no need. "Can Leopold stay with me during labor?" They laughed. It was unthinkable. Men did not attend births, even husbands. She turned to her dog, a small spaniel named Dash. At night, she held him, whispered to him, called him baby before the baby arrived. She practiced lullabies. She wrote letters to her unborn child. One read, "You are already loved more than you can ever know. I pray you have your father's steadiness, not my wild heart." If I do not hold you, know that I wanted to, with all I had." The public continued celebrating. They didn't see the swelling, the fevers, the hands trembling as she buttoned her own dress. All they saw was Charlotte smiling, in portraits, in poems, in prayers. They had turned her into something holy, and holiness is lonely. By the end of October, her labor was near. The room was prepared. The linens were white, the cribs had gold trim, doctors lined up instruments, midwives lined up prayers. Everything was ready, except the truth. Because Charlotte was not safe. Not medically, not physically, not emotionally. She was terrified, but no one allowed her to say it. The crown was too heavy, and it had no room for fear. So she smiled. She stood in the window one last time, waved to the crowd, held her belly, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she whispered, "Let me survive this. Just once. Let me be the girl I pretend to be." 2 days later, she began to bleed, and everything went wrong. In stories, birth is a beginning. But in palaces, it can be the end. Charlotte's labor was long, too long. Her cries echoed through the halls, and the empire listened, but did not move, because the truth was simple. They loved her too much to imagine her gone, and too little to save her. The sun never rose that day. Not really. It hovered. Gray, hesitant, afraid to touch the palace where a crown waited on the edge of a scream. Inside the room, Charlotte lay still. She had been in labor for 12 hours. The contractions came in waves, long and irregular. She gripped the sheets until her knuckles turned white. She bit her tongue until it bled. Still, she made no sound. Because she was royal, and royal women did not cry out. They endured, in silence, for England. By hour 15, her breathing changed. It grew shallower, slower, measured, not by instinct, but by expectation. Outside, physicians whispered. Sir Richard Croft, chief obstetrician, stood by the fire, refusing forceps. He believed in natural birth. He believed pain was part of the process. He believed intervention was more dangerous than time. But time was running out. Charlotte's pulse quickened. Her lips turned dry. Her eyes darted beneath closed lids. She reached out, but there was no hand to hold. Leopold had not been allowed inside. It was unseemly for a man to witness a royal birth. So he waited outside, listening, counting, praying. And the hours crawled forward like a noose tightening. By hour 22, Charlotte had not eaten, not drunk, not slept. Her hair clung to her face. Her skin glistened with fever. She whispered, "Is he here?" They said no. She asked for water. They said no. She asked for her mother. There was no reply, because Charlotte's mother, Caroline, had been exiled, banished by the crown years earlier. There would be no family, no comfort, only protocol. The baby had not descended. The head was large, the pelvis narrow, and still. Croft waited. He wrote in his notes, labor progressing, no signs of distress. He did not look into Charlotte's eyes. He did not count her heartbeat. He did not hear her whisper, "I feel cold inside." By hour 28, the bleeding began. First a thread, then a stream. A midwife noticed. She leaned close. Charlotte whispered, "Am I dying?" The midwife looked to Croft. He said nothing, because saying something meant acting, and acting meant admitting failure, and failure had no place in a palace. By hour 34, Charlotte lost consciousness for the first time. They revived her with smelling salts. She came back with a gasp. A sound like drowning. A sound that should not come from a princess. Croft called it fatigue. Others called it what it was: a warning. Leopold begged to enter. He was refused. He wrote a note and passed it in. It said, "My dearest, you are brave beyond belief. I wait for you." Charlotte never saw it. They placed it on the table, next to a bowl of unused cloths, next to a silver cup of untouched broth, next to a woman they no longer saw as a woman, only a vessel, a royal vessel, cracking. By hour 38, the room fell silent. No more cries, no more commands, only breathing, shallow, shaky. The baby had crowned, but there was no movement, no sound. The room shifted, not with panic, but with something worse: resignation. At hour 42, the child was born, a boy. Still, no wail, no warmth, just weight. They wrapped him in linen. Charlotte whispered, "Why don't I hear him?" No one answered. They took the body away. They buried him before sunrise, in secret, without ceremony. There was no baptism, no trumpet, no royal fanfare, only a single entry in a journal: male child, stillborn, 9 pounds. Charlotte had given them a prince, and they gave her nothing. Her body began to fail, the bleeding unstoppable, her pulse a flicker, her breath ragged. Croft called it a setback. But the midwife had seen this before. She knelt beside Charlotte, touched her cheek, whispered, "You did well." Charlotte turned her head, her eyes unfocused. She said, "Did I make them proud?" And then she closed her eyes. By hour 45, she was gone. Her heart stopped at 2:30 a.m. Outside, Leopold heard the knock. He stood. The man could not speak. He simply shook his head. And the prince, once steady, once composed, fell to his knees. Because love, real love, cannot stand when the world collapses. Croft did not cry. He did not scream. He wrote one final note. The princess passed quietly in her sleep. A lie, an elegant lie, the kind palaces prefer. But Charlotte did not pass quietly. She passed in pain, in blood, in longing, longing to live, longing to be more than a symbol, longing to hold the son they had promised her. And now, the room was cold, the bed empty, the sheets stained with the cost of legacy. They buried her within days, next to her child, both nameless in the end. The people wept, the papers mourned, the crown prepared a new plan. Because empires do not grieve, they replace. The girl was gone, the child gone, and the crown. It turned the page, because Charlotte was not the first to die for a throne, and she would not be the last. In the shadow of her coffin, a new race began. To find another womb, another bride, another name for the history books. The sun never rose that day. Not really. It hovered. Gray, hesitant, afraid to touch the palace, where a crown waited on the edge of a whisper. Inside the room, Charlotte lay still. She had been in labor for 12 hours. The hours came in waves, long and irregular. She gripped the sheets until her hands ached. She pressed her lips together until they trembled. Still, she made no sound. Because she was royal, And royal women did not cry out. They endured, in silence, for England. By hour 15, her breathing changed. It grew shallower, slower, measured not by instinct, but by expectation. Outside, physicians whispered. Sir Richard Croft, chief obstetrician, stood by the fire, declining assistance. He believed in natural birth. He believed effort was part of the process. He believed intervention was more dangerous than waiting. But time was running out. Charlotte's pulse quickened. Her lips turned dry. Her eyes flickered beneath closed lids. She reached out, but there was no hand to hold. Leopold had not been allowed inside. It was unseemly for a man to witness a royal birth. So he waited outside, listening, counting, praying. And the hours crawled forward like a quiet tightening. By hour 22, Charlotte had not eaten, not drunk, not rested. Her hair clung to her face. Her skin was flushed with effort. She whispered, "Is he here?" They said no. She asked for water. They said no. She asked for her mother. There was no reply. Because Charlotte's mother, Caroline, had been exiled, banished by the crown years earlier. There would be no family, no comfort, only protocol. The child had not moved. The path was narrow, and still, Croft waited. He wrote in his notes, "Progressing. No signs of concern." He did not meet Charlotte's eyes. He did not count her breaths. He did not hear her whisper, "I feel cold inside." By hour 28, something shifted. At first a hint, then more. A midwife noticed. She leaned close. Charlotte whispered, "Am I leaving?" The midwife looked to Croft. He said nothing, because saying something meant acting. And acting meant acknowledging failure, and failure had no place in a palace. By hour 34, Charlotte drifted away for the first time. They revived her with scented cloths. She returned with a gasp, a sound like waking from a storm. A sound no crown should require. Croft called it fatigue. Others called it what it was, a sign. Leopold begged to enter. He was refused. He wrote a note and passed it in. It said, "My dearest, you are brave beyond belief. I wait for you." Charlotte never read it. They placed it on the table, next to a bowl of unused linens, next to a silver cup of untouched broth, next to a woman no longer seen as a person, only a vessel, a royal vessel, fading. By hour 38, the room fell still. No more calls, no more orders, only breathing, uneven, quiet. The child arrived, but there was no sound, no cry, no warmth, only stillness. They wrapped him gently. Charlotte whispered, "Why don't I hear him?" No one answered. They carried him away, before sunrise, in silence, without ceremony. There was no baptism, no procession, no royal announcement, only a single line in a journal. Male child, delivered, no life signs. Charlotte had given everything, and received silence. Her strength was fading, her breath a flicker, her voice barely there. Croft called it a delay, but the midwife knew better. She knelt beside Charlotte, touched her cheek, whispered, "You did well." Charlotte turned her head, her gaze distant. She asked, "Did I make them proud?" And then she closed her eyes. By hour 45, her heart slowed. At 2:30 a.m., the room grew quiet. Outside, Leopold heard a knock. He stood. The messenger did not speak. He He only bowed his head, and the prince, once steady, once composed, lowered himself to the floor. Because some losses leave no strength to stand, Croft did not weep. He did not speak. He wrote one final note. The princess passed peacefully in her rest. A polished phrase, the kind palaces prefer. But Charlotte did not pass quietly. She left this world reaching for love, for a life that might have been, for a moment she never got to keep. And now? The room was dim, the bed still, the linens marked by legacy. They laid her to rest within days, beside her child. Neither name spoken aloud. The people mourned, the papers grieved, the crown turned the page. Because kingdoms do not pause, they prepare. The girl was gone, the child gone, and the crown, it moved on. Because Charlotte was not the first to fade behind velvet curtains, and she would not be the last. In the stillness of her chamber, a new game began. To find another name, another heir, another story for the history books. She died in November, and by March, they had begun to rewrite her. Not her life. That was too public, too beloved. But her death? Her death was up for edits, because the truth was inconvenient. And the British monarchy does not like inconvenient stories. In the official report, Charlotte passed peacefully. In her sleep, no pain, no suffering, just a quiet departure. As if her womb hadn't ruptured, as if her son hadn't died inside her, as if she hadn't begged for water, for mercy, for someone, anyone, to hold her hand. The version they wrote was simpler, softer, palatable, because the British public had loved her deeply, and now they needed a version of her death they could live with. They released paintings, not of her final hours, but of her in white, with roses, one hand on her belly, the other raised like a saint. They printed plates, postcards, memorial coins. Her smile became porcelain, frozen, sacred. And as weeks turned to months and months into years, that image replaced the truth. The press followed suit. They published poems. Our Charlotte rests in heaven's light, a gentle queen in angel white. They didn't write about the screams, the blood, the baby buried in silence. They didn't interview the midwife who had seen her eyes roll back. They didn't question the doctor who refused to act. Instead, they called it tragedy, not negligence. Even her husband, Leopold, the man who had loved her more than the crown ever could, was asked to stop speaking of her publicly. It was unhelpful, they said. It reopens wounds. He obeyed, because grief is private, but royalty never is. Behind the scenes, letters were burned. Croft's original notes, gone. Parliament never launched an inquiry. The royal family never apologized. No one was held accountable, because in their eyes, nothing had gone wrong. The system had done what it was built to do, protect the crown, even if it killed the girl wearing it. Charlotte became a lesson, but not in the way she deserved. She was used to teach women how to be dignified in pain, not how to be protected from it. Medical texts from the time praised her restraint, her stoicism. They did not mention her death. They did not call it what it was, avoidable. And as Victoria rose, the new child, the new future, Charlotte became a shadow, not a predecessor, not a warning, just a footnote. Her cousin died young, and so the crown passed on. But some remembered. Whispers in court, old servants. The woman who washed the linens after Charlotte died said, "There was so much blood. I had to burn them." She was never interviewed again, and still, the palace shined. It flourished. Victoria grew. England moved forward, because the monarchy is not built to stop. It is built to survive. And survival requires edits. Cut the noise, polish the memory, preserve the institution, even if it means erasing the girl. Years later, when Victoria asked about Charlotte, she was told she was lovely, but fragile. No more, no less. Nothing of her fire, her stubbornness, her courage, just the faint outline of a woman no one dared describe too clearly. Because if they did, they might see themselves in her. And that was dangerous. Empires prefer myths, not mirrors, so they made her a myth. Not the real Charlotte, the rewritten one. The gentle, the gracious, the smiling, not the sweating, the screaming, the dying. And yet, in private diaries, in letters tucked away in attics, her real story endured. Somewhere, someone always wrote, "They said she passed in peace, but we know better." The truth lived, not in archives, but in absence, in the fact that no statue stands for her, no holiday, no national moment of mourning, only a name on a stone, only flowers that appear every November, laid by strangers with no ceremony, just quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't honor, the kind that forgets. Her death was rewritten, her name softened, her pain erased. But the truth does not die so easily. In opera, in paintings, in whispered stories passed between generations, Charlotte never truly left. Time does not mourn, but people do. And long after the palace had moved on, after the uncles remarried, after Victoria was crowned, after the stones over Charlotte's grave began to sink beneath moss, someone lit a candle. It wasn't for ceremony, or duty, or press. It was for memory, because Charlotte, though erased, had never disappeared. She lived quietly, beneath the surface, in songs, in sketches, in whispers between mothers and daughters. And in those shadows, something stirred. The first to resurrect her was not a historian. It was an artist. A woman, anonymous, painted a portrait. Not of the Charlotte on porcelain plates, not the serene saint in white, but a different Charlotte, hair unkempt, eyes tired. One hand placed gently on her stomach, the other open, as if waiting for someone to hold it. No title, no crown, just a girl, pregnant and alone. The painting was displayed in a small gallery in Bath. It caused a quiet stir. "This isn't her," one noblewoman whispered. "This is too real." Exactly. Then came the poets. In the margins of journals, at the backs of pamphlets, in the footnotes of forgotten books, they wrote verses. She smiled for the nation, but wept for herself. Her body gave England a prince, but no one gave her mercy. They were not published widely, but they were passed along, folded into letters, tucked between pages. And still, she returned. In music. In 1832, a German composer debuted a haunting piano nocturne. He never named it, only wrote, in the corner, "Für Sie." Critics called it too mournful, but audiences wept. Because something in the notes felt like a goodbye never spoken. In the 1860s, a young nurse visited Charlotte's tomb at Windsor. She wrote in her journal, "There were no flowers, no guards, just a sense of apology in the air." That nurse? Florence Nightingale. Decades later, she would push for the inclusion of female obstetricians in Britain. She would cite Charlotte in her private notes. "No woman should be left alone to die for a child she never holds." The resurrection continued. In literature, Charlotte began to appear in novels, not as herself, but as echoes. A princess who dies in childbirth. A girl trapped between duty and desire. A crown that weighs too much for a young neck. They were not labeled Charlotte, but readers knew. Eventually, the historians followed. Slow, careful, afraid of shaking the golden dust off an uncomfortable truth, but they came. They found Croft's surviving letters. They studied the silence in official reports. They examined the medical negligence, the cultural cruelty, and they wrote it down, not with rage, not with blame, but with something rarer: remorse. By the 20th century, Charlotte had become something more than a lost princess. She was a mirror for every woman pressured to smile through pain, for every daughter told she must save her family, for every mother expected to die quietly for the sake of legacy. Her story was no longer royal. It was human. In 1976, a documentary aired on the BBC. Title: The Queen Who Never Was. It was gentle, respectful, and brutal. It played no music over the reenactment of her labor, only breath and silence. Viewers wrote in, "I never knew. Why wasn't this taught? She deserved more." And for the first time, the public grieved truthfully. In 1997, a petition was launched to place a statue of Charlotte in Kensington Gardens, holding her child. It was rejected. The Crown cited historical precedents. But in quiet corners, people placed lilies at the foot of the wall. And on one was written, in shaky handwriting, "For the girl who was never allowed to grow old." Then came the digital age. A forgotten name became a hashtag. Charlotte of Wales. The girl who smiled young women found her story on forums. They shared it not as royalty, but as sisterhood. They said, "I see myself in her. She didn't die in vain. She was me, only in silk." And perhaps the most beautiful resurrection came not from art or academia, but from fiction. Writers gave her alternate endings. She lived. She held her son. She grew old. She reigned with Leopold beside her. These were not lies. They were longings. The kind of longings a culture holds when it realizes too late what it had. Charlotte was no longer a princess. She was a possibility. A symbol not of what was, but what should have been. And in that way, she returned. Not in crowns, not in history books, but in hearts. They tried to bury her story, but the earth remembered. And now, as her name returns to lips once silenced, we must ask, not how she died, but what she taught us about how we live. She was born to be watched, and she died under watchful eyes. But no one saw her. Not really. They saw her title, her youth, her promise. They saw the future they wanted, and forgot to ask what she wanted. Princess Charlotte of Wales was not perfect. She was not polished like a porcelain doll. She laughed too loud. cried too easily, talked too much in meetings, rode her horse faster than was proper. She broke protocol, broke silence. But she never broke faith, not with her country, not with the people, not with the dream she inherited. She tried to live up to all of it, and in the end, it crushed her. She was a daughter raised to be an icon, a woman trained to smile through history, a wife who gave more than she ever received, a mother who never got to hear her child cry. They buried her in silence. But she did not go quietly, because stories like hers do not die. They sleep, they wait, and they return. This is not just her story. It is the story of every girl who carried too much, every woman praised for her smile while her bones were breaking beneath it, every life measured by what it could give to others instead of what it deserved for itself. Charlotte was not a queen, but she ruled a moment, a brief, bright breath in the lungs of a tired nation. And when she died, that nation felt it, even if they forgot to say it out loud. She has no national holiday, no crown, no throne. But she has something else. She has us, the ones who remember, the ones who ask, the ones who light candles in November and whisper, "You should have grown old." Because maybe memory is a kind of resurrection. Maybe truth is a kind of justice. Maybe telling her story, honestly, is the crown she was never allowed to wear. So here at the end, let us not say she was only a tragedy. Let us say, she was loved, she was failed. But she was never lost, not truly, not as long as we remember her name, Charlotte Augusta of Wales, the girl who smiled for a nation and died for a crown. Looking back at Charlotte's story, I don't just see a princess, I see a young woman, brave, bright, and deeply human, who was asked to carry more than any one person should. She was expected to smile through duty, pain, and fear just because a nation needed her to. And that's the part that stays with me. It's not just about royalty, it's about all of us. How often do we admire someone for staying strong when what they really needed was to be seen? Charlotte's story teaches me this. A beautiful image means nothing if it's built on someone's silence. And sometimes the cost of legacy is someone's life. I hope we learn to ask better questions, to look deeper, to care not just about what someone gives us, but about who they are when no one is watching. Because if a girl can die for a crown and be forgotten, what else are we ignoring in the name of tradition?